Keir Starmer's speech at the Labour Party conference was a mixed bag. He talked about aspiration and optimism, but there were also the clearest signals yet that Starmer's interest is strictly in the centre ground. Let's start with the more positive policy announcements, though, which suggested a serious effort to tackle climate change.
Today, I'm so proud to launch our Green Prosperity Plan, a plan that will turn the UK into a green growth superpower. And driving the plan forward is a goal that will put us ahead of any major economy in the world. 100% clean power by 2030. An effort that will double Britain's onshore wind capacity, treble solar power, quadruple offshore wind, invest in tidal, hydrogen, nuclear, back carbon capture, commit to green steel production, new renewable ports, new gigafactories, and insulate 19 million homes. This will require a different way of working, the biggest partnership between government, business and communities this country has ever seen. It will mean new jobs, more than 1 million new jobs. Training for plumbers, electricians, engineers, software designers, technicians and builders. It will all start within the first 100 days of a new Labour government. A new British sovereign wealth fund will drive us forward on this mission. We will make sure that the public money we spend building up British industry spurs on private investment, stimulates growth in construction, life sciences, finance and insurance, and the British people enjoy the returns. We won't make the mistake the Tories made with North Sea oil and gas back in the 1980s, when they frittered away the wealth from our national resources. Just look at what's happening at the moment. The largest onshore wind farm in Wales. Who owns it? Sweden. Energy bills in Swansea are paying for schools and hospitals in Stockholm. The Chinese Communist Party has a stake in our nuclear industry. And 5 million people in Britain pay their bills to an energy company owned by France. So we will set up Great British Energy within the first year of a Labour government. A new company that takes advantage of the opportunities in clean British power. And because it is right for jobs, because it is right for growth, because it is right for energy independence from tyrants like Putin, then yes, conference, Great British Energy will be publicly owned.
So there were 3 ideas there. First, massive investment in renewable energy technologies with the target of completely green energy by 2030. That's pretty ambitious. Then the second idea is to create a state-owned startup, Great British Energy, that will own those technologies and generate energy from them. And the third idea is that the profits generated by those investments and that energy will be ploughed back into a Norway-style sovereign wealth fund.
Decarbonising our energy system by 2030, obviously hugely important and necessary. And we can thank climate movements like Labour for a Green New Deal for really forcing the demand to be 2030 rather than 2050, which would be a death sentence for millions around the world. I think that the Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's a good corrective to the privatising of gains and socialising of costs that we've seen as the governing principle of our energy system for decades. I don't know what a state-owned startup is. It sounds like something that a very corny messaging specialist was paid a lot of money to come up with. I think it's much better to actually just argue for public ownership and convince people of public ownership rather than to kind of rebrand it as something else and hope that, no one will notice. The key thing here is that unlike previous iterations of Starmerism, we are actually seeing some lines being drawn in the sand between a Labour vision and a Tory vision, at a time when Truss and Rees-Mogg are talking about, increasing the number of oil projects, increasing fracking, squeezing every last drop of oil from the North Sea. The bare minimum we can expect is that a Labour Party will be sitting in contrast with that. But our expectations have been lowered so much that it is somewhat of a shift and somewhat of a surprise. I think a lot of this pressure that has resulted in this is coming partly internally. I think particularly, I have a feeling from, an Ed Miliband maybe, as he's kind of up to date and yeah, like more in touch with movements about the climate stuff. And of course, it's coming externally from things like the Don't Pay campaign, from Enough is Enough, etc. But crucially, these climate policies are not the kind of transformative and holistic Green New Deal policies that we have seen in previous Labour Party manifestos. It's much more of a top-down state intervention process to try and kind of manage capitalism a little bit better. It's very much about, not transforming our energy markets, but just sort of tinkering around the edges, which is not enough. It's not enough for the scale of crisis that climate breakdown represents. And I think that what's more indicative of the kind of approach, what has been consistent throughout this entire thing, throughout the entire era of Starmer, that is also represented here, is that despite these major policy announcements being climate-based, the actual movements on the ground that are organizing around this, I'm thinking, of Labour for a Green New Deal here, have been entirely shut out from the process. Labour for a Green New Deal were not allowed to debate their conference motion. It's this very top-down, anti-democratic approach to explicitly basically make sure that no movement can ever be built in conjunction with what's happening at the top of the party. And that's to make sure that you never have a situation where, the movement can push the party or challenge the party or create space for the party to move into kind of more radical action. And frankly, things as ambitious as decarbonizing our energy system by 2030 is not going to happen without the buy-in of climate movements, of civil society movements, and most importantly, of labor movements. And that kind of attempt to force it on top down means that, especially if we wait until 2024 for a Labour government giving us 6 years to decarbonize our energy system, it's just not the kind of power that needs to be built in order to do that.
Yeah, I suppose, one thing that some people on the left are disappointed about, nothing's getting nationalized here. So what's being proposed is they're going to create a new company that is going to invest and create energy. So the energy companies, which, essentially Keir Starmer promised he would nationalize in his leadership election, they're going to continue as they are. So you can see how it's sort of a policy which is progressive, yeah, but it's not going to win him any enemies in the business world. And you can make whatever you want from that. Because he's Keir Starmer, there were also policies based on the kind of ideas that impress soft Tories and the right of the Labour Party.
I've seen home ownership rise almost my entire life. It's the bedrock of security and aspiration. That Pebble Dash semi meant everything to my family. But now, under the Tories, the dream of owning your own home is slipping away for too many. And that's a political choice. Because if you keep inflating demand without increasing supply, house prices will only rise and homes become less affordable for working people. So we will set a new target, 70% home ownership. And we will meet it with a new set of political choices, a Labour set of political choices. No more buy-to-let landlords or second homeowners getting in first. We will back working people's aspirations. Help first-time buyers onto the ladder with a new mortgage guarantee scheme. Reform planning so speculators can't stop communities getting shovels in the ground. My message is this. If you're grafting every hour to buy your own home, Labour is on your side. Labour is the party of home ownership in Britain today. I will make work pay for people who create this country's wealth. I will make sure we buy, make and sell more in Britain. I will revitalise public services and control immigration using a points-based system. I will spread power and opportunity to all our communities. And I will never be shy to use the power of government to help working people succeed. Labour will make Brexit work. Labour will deliver change. And you'll never get that from the Tories.
It was that policy on housing that I think I found particularly disappointing, and especially that target to get 70% of the country as homeowners. Because what's a side note there, what just becomes a side issue is renters. And if you're going to have 70% of the country as homeowners, you're going to have 30% who are renters. And what we have had for the past, few decades, ever since the sort of start of the 1980s, is that the people who dictate government policy are homeowners. That means homeowners get tax incentives. It's cheaper to have a mortgage than it is to rent. There's been all of these benefits going to buy-to-let landlords. I know Keir Starmer is saying they won't get first dibs on houses, but one of the most sort of Weasley policies I always find is when politicians say, oh, local people will get the first chance to buy these houses, or local people will get the first chance to rent these houses. Well, if you can't afford them, getting the first chance doesn't mean very much. So to me, this is disappointing because essentially I think we're moving into a situation. I think at the moment, you've got about 65% of the population are homeowners. The number of renters is growing. On one level, that is a symptom of a defunct housing market, house prices being incredibly expensive. On the other hand, it's actually an opportunity because if the number of renters in the population is growing, maybe finally we can move away from a system where housing policy is all geared towards homeowners, which I think inevitably ends up with this sort of speculative race where you've got governments who are terrified of house prices falling and then renters get screwed over. So if I was Keir Starmer there, what I'd want him to be focusing on is let's make housing more affordable, but let's make it so that people don't necessarily need to buy a house because renting is an affordable and attractive option. And that's why I think setting a target for homeowners is completely backwards. What you want to do is say, our target is to make housing affordable, and then people can decide whether they want to rent or whether they want to buy. I'm quite happy renting. I'm just annoyed that it costs so much money and I have so little security. I'd much prefer that we were a country like Germany where more than half of the population rent because renting's actually secure, reasonable, attractive.
Firstly, on the housing thing, I think it's really important to recognize that there is now a shift away from social housing model, which actually has really profound effects because the whole concept of social housing is that everyone has a right to housing infrastructure. And also, there was a political and a social goal to social housing, which was to have integrated social housing, which was going to create a more harmonious, equal, integrated society. And so, as for all the reasons you outlined, increasing the percentage of homeowners by 5% is not going to make us a more equal or harmonious society. As for the points-based immigration system, essentially what this represents to me is actually how far right we have gone on immigration, because what a points-based immigration system essentially does is it only allows legal pathways to migration for the richest, for people who are wealthy, for people who can be on jobs that can pay them enough, higher than I think it's like 30,000 or 36,000 it might be, who can pay them a high salary. People who are going into high wage jobs, or people who have pre-existing wealth to support themselves or to support their dependents. And what it does is then all of those people who come into this country to take up low wage work, so that is, people who more often than not have been displaced from their own homes, either as a result of British foreign policy or as a result of the activities of British companies, or as a result, more indirectly, of a system that is set up to create wealth for countries like Britain at the expense of countries of the global south. Those people that then migrate to Britain in order to take up jobs in the low wage economy are forced to do that in an irregular way and therefore are exempted from any kind of social service and are at the sharp edge of criminalization and are heavily policed. So that is why a points-based system is a deeply reactionary system, because it basically means that the only legal routes to migration, the routes where you can have access to some social services, the routes where you're not constantly worried that you're going to have your workplace raided or you're going to be deported, is for the very, very, very rich. It doesn't stop the movement of low wage workers. It just makes it so that their movement is irregular and is criminalized, which obviously has deeply distressing negative impacts for not only the people experiencing that criminalization, but for the communities in which they live. So that is what a points-based system does. And that's why it's much less desirable than, from a progressive standpoint, than freedom of movement.
Yeah, I can see why it's less progressive from a progressive standpoint than freedom of movement. But I mean, if freedom of movement's off the table, and I suppose for me, a points-based system, I mean, a critique I've seen is it doesn't mean very much because it depends what you give points for. But if you give points for family membership as well as money, if you give points for, are you going to work in the NHS as well as how much money have you got? then it doesn't seem to me that it's necessarily more reactionary than any other immigration policy other than free movement. So obviously I can see why people who want open borders are criticizing this. But if you've already accepted that you're not going to have open borders, I don't really see why Starmer talking about a points-based system caused such consternation. I don't know what you make of that.
Well, I think what we want, if we are going to have an immigration system, what we want is a very liberal immigration system with multiple pathways for regular migration. What a points-based system typically does, and obviously, theoretically, you could give points for anything, but in reality, what it often means is that you give points to people who come from the upper classes, but you don't actually get rid of the root causes of displacement or the gaps in the labor market that then pulls displaced people typically from the global south. What you do is you just criminalize it. So what I would want to see from the Labour Party is less about talking about what kind of immigration system we would have other than having a really liberal immigration system, but actually about defunding the border industry to remove and to decriminalize migration, essentially, to make it so that you don't have border guards in the NHS, border guards in education systems, border guards in public services, and essentially a papers, please society for racialized people and for migrants. That's much more tackling the fact that the way that our world economic system is set up is that we push people from economies of the global south into the economies of the global north, and we criminalize that movement despite it being integral to the functioning of our economies in the global north. But by having that overwhelming threat of deportation, creating the conditions of desperation that irregular movement creates, means that they are a much more pliable and easily exploitable workforce. And so that's why a points-based system, rather than a move to actually decriminalize movement and not create this vast infrastructure of surveillance and bordering that permeates every part of our society, that's what the Labour Party should be focusing on, rather than this talk of a points-based system, which in reality adds to that infrastructure of criminalization and privileges only wealthy migrants, essentially.
Final thing from Keir Starmer's speech, peppered throughout it were some pretty overt references to Blairism.
On climate change, growth, aspiration, levelling up, Brexit, economic responsibility, we are the party of the centre ground. Once again, the political wing of the British people.
The political wing of the British people is how Blair described New Labour before the 1997 general election. Sounds like the only thing it reminds me of is the political wing of the IRA. That's sort of the only time I hear that phrase mentioned. So it does strike me as slightly an odd slogan. The media classes, though, did lap it up. Sky's Beth Rigby tweeted this. Labour and its leader have changed a lot in a year. Keir Starmer, heckled by the left in his 2021 speech, cheered to rafters, even as he positions himself heir to Blair. Starmer's Labour, the party of business, of aspiration, of the centre ground. Starmer more confident than I've ever seen him. Hope turns to belief. What the hell is going on there? I feel like I don't even need to provide any comment to that because it's pretty just bizarre. Let's go to The Guardian's Pippa Garage. She said this. Snap analysis. This instantly came to her. Keir Starmer finished his speech with, as in 1945, 1964, 1997, this is a Labour moment. For the first time in years, the party actually looks and sounds like a government in waiting. There will be difficult times ahead, but he took a big step forwards today. And then we have Robert Peston, Starmer speech nutshelled. Interesting verb. Public money for green energy to spur growth, including creation of publicly owned green power generator. Labour back in the centre ground. Sir Keir proudly working class. Labour will rescue the Tory devalued pound. Enough ovations to make a dictator proud. Political journalists are really weird. I don't know, who do they think that's impressing other than Keir Starmer's PR team? I suppose that dictator one won't necessarily please them, although they do have some dictatorial tendencies that they don't seem particularly ashamed of.